How's it going, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 21 of Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, The Duel at Arualuen. Let's go ahead and get into it. Dawn was nearly breaking by the time they finished discussing their plans for the coming battle. Maddie joined Gillen and Horace as they made their usual pre-dawn patrol around the palisade, paying particular attention to the goings-on in the Red Fox camp below the south wall. Everything seemed normal, with the camp awakening and fires being stirred into life. Gillen glanced at the red ball of the sun rising over the forest in the east, then jerked a thumb down at the enemy camp. "Maybe you'd better stay here until dark," he said. "You might be spotted going back down the hill in daylight." Maddie snorted. "You don't have a whole lot of faith in my unseen movement skills, do you?" He smiled at her. "It's just that people will be moving around down there, and there's always the chance someone might tread on your hand," he said. She rolled her eyes at him. "I'm never going to live that down, am I?" He grinned. "I shouldn't think so." "Well, I'll have you know, when I was escaping from the Red Foxes, after I heard them plotting in the old abbey, somebody did step on my hand, and I still wasn't discovered." Horace looked between the two of them, a slightly puzzled look on his face. "Why would anyone step on your hand?" he asked. Gillen waved the question aside. "It's just a ranger thing," he said. Horace sighed. After years of adventuring with Will and Halt, he was used to being palmed off with that answer, or something like it, when they wanted to leave him out of a joke. He regarded his daughter now, seeing her hiding a grin. "That sort of thing isn't very respectful," he said. "I can't do anything about Gillen, but I am your father, after all." She tried, unsuccessfully, to stop grinning. "And highly respected, too," she said in her most dutiful daughter voice. "Ha!" said Horace skeptically. Then a thought struck him, and he brightened. "It just occurred to me," he said. "If we're breaking out of here in the next few days, we won't have to ration the food anymore. I can finally have a decent breakfast." With that cheerful thought, he hurried through the rest of their morning patrol, and then climbed down the stairs and headed across to the cookhouse to give the duty cooks the news. For the first time in weeks, Horace enjoyed a proper breakfast, sighing with contentment as he mopped up the last scraps of food with a piece of toasted flatbread, then leaning back to savor his coffee. Maddie, who had joined them for breakfast, pushed her chair back, stretching her arms above her head, and yawned. "I might get some sleep," she said. "I was up all last night, and it looks as if I'll be up again tonight as well." "Use my tent," Horace told her. "It's got a good soft bed." Of course, as a ranger, she could sleep quite comfortably on the hard ground, wrapped in her cloak, Gillen said. Maddie looked at him sidelong. "I could do that, as you say, but it's not obligatory," she replied. Gillen raised his eyebrows. "I could make it in order." She smiled sweetly at him. "And I would ignore you, if you did." Gillen sighed. "My authority seems to be slipping. Young people just don't have the respect they used to. When I was young, I never would have spoken to my commandant with such disrespect. But things were so different in the olden days. I've often wondered, how did you manage before they discovered fire?" Maddie said. Gillen decided to quit while he was behind. "Get some sleep," he said. Maddie rose, grinning, then yawned, and headed for Horace's tent. Gillen glanced at the big warrior, who was smothering a yawn of his own. "What about you? You were up half the night as well." "I'll take your tent," Horace said. You could sleep on the hard ground, rolled in your cloak. You're a ranger, after all. Maddie slept till mid-afternoon, and awoke refreshed and hungry. She and her father had an early supper, then, once it was fully dark, she slipped over the east wall and slid down a rope to the grassy path below. She looked up and saw 2 heads craning over the palisade. She waved a hand in farewell. "Bye, Dad. Bye, Gillen," she called softly. "I'll see you tomorrow." "Bye, Maddie. Take care," her father called in reply. In the darkness, he could still see the quick gleam of her teeth as she smiled up at him. "I always do," she said. Then she slipped over the edge of the terrace and began to make her way down the hill. Gillen and Horace stayed, watching her. Before too long, Horace had lost sight of her completely. Gillen kept her in sight a little longer, but only because he could anticipate which way she would go in the moving shadows. "She's very good," he said to Horace. "Will has taught her well." "You're all very good," Horace said. "I can never see any of you once you start sneaking around." "Sneaking around?" said Gillen in a hurt voice. "We prefer to call it unseen movement." "Call it what you like," Horace said. "To me, it's sneaking around." They moved to the south wall, to keep an eye on the enemy's camp, watching to see if there was any sign that Maddie had been spotted. But there was no sound of alarm or outcry, and, after an hour, Gillen touched Horace's sleeve. "She'll be through their lines by now," he reassured his friend. "Let's get something to eat." It was the best way he could think of to stop Horace worrying about his daughter. Maddie skirted the Red Fox camp on the eastern side, moving in a wide semicircle to reach the slope running up behind it to the southern ridge. Staying in a crouch, she moved uphill, using the long, gently swaying grass for cover. Once she reached the spine of the ridge, she rolled over to the far side, avoiding silhouetting herself against the night sky. She lay still for a few moments, listening and watching to see if there were any patrols moving in the valley below, on the south side of the ridge. There was nothing. Lying on her belly, she looked back to the hill fort, straining to see if she could make out her father and Gillen on the ramparts. But the darkness defeated her. She could see the glow of the campfires inside the compound, but that didn't give enough light to identify individuals on the wall. A little sadly, she turned away. "Bye, Dad," she muttered. Continuing to move carefully, she went down the slope, then up the far side until she reached the cover of the tree line. Then she stood upright and jogged through the forest, her bow strung and ready in her hand, toward the Scandians' campsite. As she approached the camp's central fire, she was pleased to see that Hal had set a proper watch, with the ring of sentries set well outside the reach of the firelight. Each man stood in the shadow of a tree, where he was not immediately visible. Anyone without her skill at remaining unseen would have been spotted and challenged before he could get close to the campsite. Nor had Hal concentrated his sentries on the side nearest the enemy camp, as a lot of commanders would have done. His sentries covered the relatively safer western perimeter as well, even though it might have been reasonable to assume that there was no danger likely to come from that direction. She nodded approvingly. Danger, she knew, could come from any direction. She worked her way carefully through the trees until she was 5 meters from one of the sentries. He was carrying a spear and one of the Scandians' big, round shields, and she had no wish to come upon him unexpectedly and risk being speared. She stayed behind a tree and called softly. "Hello? It's me, the ranger." The sentry, who had been leaning on his spear in an at-ease position, immediately stiffened into a ready posture and dropped into a crouch, shield up, spear pointing outward, eyes searching the darkness ahead of him. "Who's there? Where are you?" he called, keeping his voice low. "I'm behind a tree, close by you. Now lower your spear, and I'll step out into the light. Just don't do anything I might regret. I told you, I'm Maddie, the ranger." He continued to probe the darkness, but still saw nothing. After a few seconds, he lowered the point of his spear and stood up from his crouch. "All right," he said. "Step out and let me see you. But no tricks." Pushing her cloak and cowl back, she stepped quietly out into the open. Her bow slung over her shoulders, and both hands extended to the sides to show that she carried no weapons. She saw the man relax as he recognized her. He shook his head. "By Orlog's earlobes, you startled me," he said, an admiring tone in his voice. "How did you get so close without me seeing you?" She shrugged. "We're trained for that sort of thing," she said. "All right if I come forward now?" Yes, by all means," he told her, beckoning with the hand that held the spear for her to move toward him. She did so, being careful not to move too quickly, letting him get a good look at her. "Sorry about that," she said, "but I couldn't really blunder through the trees for everyone to hear, could I?" He grinned at her. "No, I suppose not. Just don't tell the others that I never saw you till you called out. I'll be a laughingstock." She smiled. "It'll be our secret," she said. "Where's Hal?" "He'll be in that smaller tent on the left," he said, pointing again with the spear. Most of the men slept in a large tent consisting of a tarpaulin stretched over a center ridgepole. Hal, as leader of the force, was entitled to a tent by himself, and, knowing how much his comrades snored, he inevitably took advantage of the fact. Maddie nodded her thanks and set out toward the camp. A few of the Scandians looked up at her curiously as she passed, no doubt wondering where she had sprung from. She nodded greetings to them and continued on her way, unchallenged. As she came closer to the smaller tent, the flaps were thrown back, and Hal emerged, bending from the waist to negotiate the low opening. He saw her, and his face lit up with a smile. "You're back," he said. "We wondered where you got to." "Gillen thought it would be better if I waited till it was dark before I came back," she said. He nodded. "Very wise. So did you set a time for the attack?" "Tomorrow, mid-morning. Does that give you time to get ready?" "Plenty. The men are getting bored sitting here doing nothing." "Good. We'll set out just after dawn, so we're in position in plenty of time." She glanced at the small cook fire and the battered coffee pot resting in the glowing embers beside it. "Now, if you'll pour me a cup of coffee, I'll go over the plan with you." And that's going to be the end of chapter number 21. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next time in chapter 22. God bless, and have a good one.